Welcome back to the Deadly Digest. We're talking about the West Memphis 3. We've already covered how the police investigated, but perhaps more importantly, how the press treated it. There was no firm evidence that any of the boys had been sexually abused, but that didn't stop police from immediately claiming the murders were the result of satanic cult activity, including sexual abuse and genital mutilation. The press ran with it, titillating, sensationalizing, shocking. The Satanic Panic. Dee, you got some info on the Satanic Panic, don't you?
Do I? I just thought it was important to put this in context, because without knowing about the Satanic Panic, it just looks like, why? You know, why did this happen? So I'm going to give the whole rundown of the Satanic Panic. It's generally agreed that the real start was in 1980, when this book called Michelle Remembers was published. And what it was this lurid misery porn memoir by this woman who supposedly had recovered these memories with the help of her psychiatrist and later husband, Dr. Lawrence Pasder. So these recovered memories, she was, horribly abused by her mother and this coven of Satanists, and, raped with a snake, and she had horns and a tail surgically grafted onto her body, forced to defecate on a Bible, just like all kinds of just crazy, insane stuff. And people just ate that shit up. I mean, it was all over the place on the bestseller list. People loved it. And it kind of sparked this thing that other psychiatrists and therapists started using these recovered memory techniques, which, by the way, were not good techniques, just put it that way. And so children in daycares across the country started having these recovered memories of being abused in this satanic ritual cult activity, sexually abused, forced to do all kinds of horrible things. And the first case, probably the most famous case, is the McMartin Preschool in California. I kind of think of them as like bookends. The McMartin family is at the beginning, and then the West Memphis 3 are kind of at the end of this whole hysteria. But, they were accused of all kinds of horrible things, and, they lost their business. They had to go through this huge, long trial. It was like the longest trial in California history, I think. And eventually they were all acquitted because there was zero evidence of any of this going on. But they had lost their lives, their livelihoods, their business. They were just destroyed. And it wasn't just them. Like, these same accusations were brought up against hundreds of daycares all across the country because of this. And there's so much more to go into that, but we're just going to kind of skim the surface. The next part of it that I think was really interesting that starts to tie into the West Memphis 3 case is that it spawned this sort of cottage industry of cult experts. And Dale Griffiths is one of them, which we'll talk about in the next segment. Many of them would claim to be former Satanists, and so they knew, they had inside information, but they found Jesus, and now they were going around to warn the country about this horrible scourge. And they basically claimed that there was this huge network of satanic cults all around the country who were opening up daycares specifically to have access to children so that they could abuse them and do these weird rituals and sacrifice them. They were making claims that between 30,000 and 60,000 children a year were being abducted and killed by Satanists. Now, just to put that in perspective, that was like 3 times the number of actual murders in the country. So this was crazy just on the face of it, okay?
Apparently all these daycares had like ginormous crawl spaces underneath them.
Right.
That no one ever found.
Right, and of course no one ever found the bones of all these animals and kids that were being sacrificed. It was super crazy. And then so of course it began to metastasize into these churches and religious organizations who, would read these books and see these videotapes, hear these people speaking, and now it wasn't just daycares, it was anything they didn't like. It was heavy metal music, it was Dungeons and Dragons, even popular toys. Like I remember at one point, He-Man and the Smurfs were being accused of somehow luring children into Satanism.
That's my whole childhood.
Right?
Right?
Right? Yeah, I mean, it was insane. And the Dungeons and Dragons thing, they even made that horrible made-for-TV movie starring Tom Hanks called Mazes and Monsters. We will never let him forget that. He may have everyone else snowed with this nice guy act, but I saw Mazes and Monsters.
Yeah,
That
we got
was
an
a-
axe to grind.
Yeah, that was a huge steaming pile of shit. So, so the sad thing though is that it was taken by the authorities as being real. And so like teachers and principals and counselors in public schools, I mean, I don't know if it was all over the country, but it was definitely in the Bible Belt. You know, if you came to school with the player's handbook or some D&D dice, they would confiscate them and you would either be sent home or put in suspension. Same with wearing a Metallica t-shirt, like that Iron Maiden shirt. If I'd have showed up at West Fork High School in that shirt, I would have been sent home and probably suspended. So they were taking this seriously. And it wasn't just in the schools, it was law enforcement as well. They were believing this line that people like Dale Griffiths particularly were putting out about, you know, this is this huge menace of Satanists abducting and killing children. So it was in this milieu that we have the West Memphis 3 case. And so as soon as the police started telling the media that this was satanic ritual abuse, I mean, it just whipped people into a frenzy. I do want to point out, though, that this happened in 1993 after these things had been debunked. So I believe it was in 92, a member of the FBI actually did a really deep dive research into cult ritual abuse in the United States and found it wasn't happening. There was no evidence that any of this was happening. And he published it. You can find it online that it was like, yeah, here's all the things they say, and yeah, it's not happening. And then I believe it was in 93, the same year, that there was a reporter who decided to really take a critical look at that book, Michelle Remembers. And to the surprise of no one with half a brain cell, none of this woman's memories, none of it could be corroborated. And in fact, a lot of them were particularly disproven that that could not have been the case. So by 1993, all the basis of the Satanic Panic had been debunked in law enforcement and the media. But this is Arkansas, and it takes us a little while, right?
Sometimes we hang on to our traditions a little too long.
Yeah, especially the really bad ones. So yeah, so it was still pretty hot in Arkansas in 1993, and like their defense attorneys said, the town was like a lynch mob. Like people were so angry, and particularly Mark Byers, the father of Christopher Byers, he was really outspoken and really angry at these 3 boys for what he thought they had done. And this was the environment in which this case was brought to trial.
I mean, I get that as a mom. I get the environment. You know, I think you're just scrambling and you know, hoping and praying that there's an explanation for why these boys were taken. I get that. And it's also hard, I think, as human beings for us to imagine, well, what sort of person would do that? I mean, by God, it's got to be somebody who varies from the norm, because if not, they might be somebody that we know or someone in our family. And, you know, of course, the research shows that most children are abused by people that they know and in their family. And so, you know, I can understand it, and that explains why this Satanic Panic and the occult material was used to fill in the evidentiary gaps there. Where it was lacking, they just plugged in a little bit of an occult.
Right. Well, and that goes right into what I kind of wanted to talk about was the trial itself. Was, as you said, they used the satanic allegations to fill in the lack of evidence. Do you want to talk a little bit about the trial?
Sure. I mean, I think that from the start, there was no motive. Why would these boys have engaged as a group to murder these children? I mean, as you mentioned in an earlier segment, Mr. Miskelly wasn't even closely associated with Jason and Damien. and essentially drug himself into this under the coerced confession. But the prosecutor's job is to seek the truth.
Right.
I think in this instance, the pressures of the community and the pressures of having to, give the people answers about why this happened led them to follow a narrow path to this happened because of Satanism, the occult. And it was very easy to just jump right in and demonize. I mean, you've got a kid named Damien, right? Makes it super easy. But, from the get-go, to fill in the absence of motive, the occult took its place.
Right, and there wasn't any evidence either linking them with the boys or with the crime scene or any of these things.
No, there was no evidence. Without the Miss Kelly confession, truly there was just a void. Now, things came up later. A knife was discovered in a lake, and the prosecutors put forth that was Damien Eccles' knife. Mr. Miskelly had mentioned that there was that Damien had a knife at the scene, but he described a knife that had no serration, which again wouldn't have been consistent with the state's position that the injuries to the boys were caused by a serrated knife, and it was just all over the place. But once the expert came in to wrap it all up, and I say expert in air quotes, to wrap it all up and explain how just because we as reasonable human beings can't link the murder to Damien Eccles and Jason Baldwin and Jesse Miskelly, don't worry. I can help you with that because I know a lot about the occult and I can help you make sense of it. And
Right.
That's what he did.
Yeah, and he was so bogus. They objected. The defense objected to him on the grounds that he did not fulfill any criteria as an actual expert in anything. Like, his degree was some mail order degree from this college that ended up it lost its accreditation because it was a diploma mill. I mean, it was utter crap. And we're talking about Dale Griffiths here.
And yet the judge allowed it.
Yeah.
He did, and I think that's something as a criminal defense attorney, to me, that was very interesting. And I'm happy to report that the Arkansas Rules of Evidence and the thresholds for admitting expert testimony have changed since then. I think most judges would require some showing of the Daubert factors, which are there. It's from a case, federal case, Daubert, and the courts will look to see if there are some indicia of reliability in the experts' credentials, in their opinion, their methods. Have they been published and recognized by other respected members of the scientific community? There's some burden there to get that evidence in. And at the time of the trial, there really wasn't. The judge was pretty much like, well, if it might help,
Right.
might help explain things. And I saw something that was recently released, or more recently than some of the other material from HBO, where there was an audio file where the trial judge was making some rulings on the expert testimony, and he sort of off the cuff said, which it wasn't captured by the court reporter, he said, well, to the prosecutor, if you want to go talk about the devil, I mean, I'll listen. It's shocking now. Now, in the heat of a trial, lots of things get said, and everybody's trying not to make mistakes. But I have confidence that our rules and the education and training of the judges, maybe that wouldn't happen now.
Hopefully.
I just feel like we've moved on from then. I really
Good.
hope.
I do too. That's good. I'm really glad to hear that. When you told me that, I was like, well, at least something did improve from that. Because, as an actual occult expert, I can tell you he was completely full of shit. Like, the stuff that he said was just flat out wrong. Like, that it was sacred, the number 8 was a special occult number. Like, no, it's not actually. So, and he just said all kinds of just crazy stuff that
The 3 boys and the multiples of 3 and 666, and I am not an occult expert. But from reading his testimony, Griffith's testimony, to me, it seemed like I could very much be an occult expert by just spouting off the things that I have read,
Let's
in
make
the
things
National
up.
Enquirer.
Yeah.
I mean, that was a very tragic moment, I think, in Arkansas trial history, that this individual was permitted to spout all that off, and it was obviously convincing to the jury.
Right. Well, and it wasn't just that he was at this jury. I mean, he put himself as an expert. He would testify and do classes and do things with the FBI and law enforcement all over the country. So it wasn't like they just found some wacko out in the woods and pulled him in. I mean, this man put himself forward as an expert. Other law enforcement agencies considered him an expert, but, he obviously wasn't. So yeah, that was a really heinous part of the trial.
He apparently made a good living doing it.
Yeah.
So how did the trial wind up?
Well, not good if you're the defendant.
Yeah.
Right. Yes. Well, Damien Eccles got the death penalty. Jason Baldwin got life without possibility of parole,
Yes,
I
ma'am.
believe. And then Jesse Miskelly, whose confession, quote unquote, was what they hung this whole trial on, he got life plus 40 years. And I mean, that was the part that really kind of broke my heart, was he didn't even get like a deal for it or anything. He just got screwed just like the other boys
Got
did.
hammered, yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't pretend to know what really happened, but I think looking at it from the perspective of having doubt, about these teenagers' guilt, you certainly look at, well, Miss Kelly wouldn't sell his soul for a better deal. He wouldn't testify against the other, against Baldwin and Eccles in their trial, and that's got to mean something.
Right.
I mean, if you're facing that kind of sentence, there's desperation there, and I think it must mean something to us as onlookers that he wouldn't do that.
Right.
That he held by. All of them have stood by their innocence and continue to do so, and there's some meaning there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this is going to wrap up this segment of the West Memphis 3. And for our next part, we are going to talk a little bit about the fallout from the trial, the backlash, some new evidence, and how everything all turned out. So catch us next time on the Deadly Digest.